Just to introduce Gonzalo and Stefania, Dr. Azam Chaudhary is the Dean of Economics at the Lahore School of Economics, just joined as panelist as well. So you're on mute.
Azam, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, Farah, I didn't hear you.
I was just introducing everyone, so I was just telling them that you've joined.
Sorry. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Hello.
So I guess we can start in a minute or so. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for the 4th Virtual Applied Development Economics webinar, which is jointly organized by the Lahore School of Economics, International Growth Center, Pakistan, and the Consortium for Development Policy Research. We're very excited to have with us today Dr. Gonzalo Varela and Dr. Stefania Lovo. Dr. Varela is a senior economist in the macroeconomics, trade and investment global practice of the World Bank. His work primarily focuses on trade and investment policy and how it affects firm performance. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex. Dr. Lovo is a lecturer in economics in the University of Reading. She is also a visiting fellow at the Center for Globalization Research at Queen Mary, as well as the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Her research interests include development economics, environmental economics, political economy, and policy impact evaluation. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to our speaker, Dr. Gonzalo.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity to present our work. This is work in progress with Stefania Lovo that has been introduced already. She's actually a senior economist. I think this is relatively news to all of us. And basically, this is a paper on internationally linked firms, integration reforms and productivity in Pakistan. So that is basically the main topic of this paper. So the central question is, what is it that drives productivity improvements in Pakistan, focusing on the firm level? And then what is the role that trade and investment integration has had in productivity dynamics? And these questions are relevant. They're relevant in general. There is a lot of literature on this subject, but it is particularly relevant for the case of Pakistan, where there are three elements that make it quite relevant. One is that there is an active policy debate, even today, on the need for tariff protection as a tool for industrial development. So this conversation about tariffs as a way of protecting infant industries is quite active is quite active in Pakistan. One can see it in newspapers quite frequently. Second is that tariffs are actively used as a source of revenue mobilization for the government. So Pakistan collects about 15% of its total tax revenues come from actually import duties, which is relatively high given its level of development. And third is that there is quite a need to boost productivity in Pakistan. With growth decelerating, productivity is going to be a source for upgrading and sustaining growth patterns. So if one thinks about aggregate TFP performance, one can rely on, for example, the data from the Asia Productivity Organization that reports macro indicators on total factor productivity based on a solo residual. And it shows basically two main patterns. You can see it in the chart on the screen. The first pattern is that productivity, being that you measure it, as I mentioned, as a solo residual total factor productivity, or you measure it as a labor productivity indicator, has been declining. Total factor productivity in the 80s was growing at a rate close to 3%. In the 90s, that growth fell to about 2%. Since the turn of the century, that growth was at 1%. So a decline in the growth rates of productivity. And that contrasts, and this is the second pattern that this data reveals, is sharp contrast with what is happening in some comparator countries. And take regional comparators, India or Bangladesh. And what you see is that productivity, in this case labor, is higher, but it's also growing over time rather than falling. The second element is what is happening in the front of trade policy. So on the trade policy front, one key feature of the Pakistan economy is quite protected. So Pakistan ranks 7th as the most protected economy using the overall trade restrictiveness index that the World Bank constructs. This was data for 2019. The overall trade restrictiveness index measures protection both in terms of tariffs and in terms of non-tariff measures. So it is a one aggregate indicator, synthetic indicator of these two dimensions of protection. If one focuses on what has been happening with tariffs, tariff reductions had some traction in the 1990s, but basically they stopped in the mid-2000s in Pakistan. And there was a spike in tariffs. If one focuses on the period of analysis for this paper, 2012-2018, there was a spike in tariffs in 2013 as a consequence of the twin crisis, a balance of payments crisis, and a fiscal crisis that the country faced in 2013. So tariffs increased, and you can see that in the left-hand side of this scatter plot, in which you have tariffs on the horizontal and in 2012 and tariffs in 2013 in the vertical. What you see is that in virtually all sectors of the economy, tariffs were increased in 2013. And then there was a process of simplification of tariffs that was associated with a stabilization plan linked to the IMF extended funds facility that was agreed with the government of Pakistan in late 2013, that led to a process of rationalization. So this process of rationalization implied a simplification of the tariff structure, which meant that in some cases where tariffs were low, tariffs were increased, and in cases in which tariffs were higher, tariffs were decreased. And this is what you can see in the right-hand side of that scatter, in which it was high tariffs in 2013 that actually fell, and low tariffs that were actually increased, reducing the dispersion of this tariff schedule. Now, not all firms that import actually pay import duties, right? So there is a widespread use of duty exemptions in various forms, and these duty exemptions mainly apply, but not only, but mainly apply to firms that export and import intermediates or raw materials to produce exportable goods. So these exporters are eligible for duty exemptions in different forms. Basically, they can be suspension of duties, so they never paid in the first place, or they can be refunds. They pay them, and then they have a process of claiming for a refund. The process, the firms that are eligible for suspension are very few. There are a handful. Most firms go through a process of refunds. And one of the things that we see is that claiming refunds, and this is something you can also see in the newspapers, but also you see it in the data, is that claiming refunds is a very complicated process. What we did was we ran an online survey among 80 exporters, and we found some interesting features about the way these exemption schemes work. So we took two, the manufacturing under bond, MUB, and the DTRE, that is the duty tax remission for exporters. And basically 40% of the respondents told us that it took about 60 or less days to get the refunds, but for 60%, it took them more than 60, and in some cases, it took more than a year actually to get these refunds. It is also complex from the point of view of the procedures. So the documents required, for example, to file for manufacture under bond is about 12, and for DTRE was about 20, based on the responses we got from the survey. So basically, this process has the process of claiming exemptions or refunds on the duties paid on intermediates is a process that has a large fixed cost component. So that means that the average cost of claiming exemptions falls with firm size. So for larger firms, the average cost is low, but for smaller firms, the average cost is relatively high. And this is why, if you look at the data, you see that 75% of exemptions are claimed by the largest 100 exporters that do not account for 75% of exports. So the other dimension of integration, apart from trade, is the dimension of foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment has been foreign direct investment attraction has been lackluster in Pakistan. It has been low as a share of GDP, way below 1% over the last years, and lower than what we see in our comparator countries. So basically what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand what the productivity dynamics at the firm level are using data on publicly listed firms in Pakistan. And we're going to focus on exporters and foreign-owned firms. And we're going to look at to what extent integration in the global marketplace is explaining productivity patterns observed, and what role do distortions that exist in upstream markets, both for merchandise and for services, affect this productivity. So basically, distortions in merchandise sectors are going to be captured by tariffs on inputs, and distortions on services are going to be captured by the amount of FDI that there is in the services sector. We are also going to be looking at the role that these duty exemptions that exporters are in principle eligible to get, what happens with those? How do they play in our story? So just to give you a preview of the findings in case people get bored and disconnect halfway through. We have basically four main findings. The first finding is that productivity at the firm level has been stagnant, with aggregate increases driven mainly by reallocation of resources into more productive firms rather than by increases on average productivity of firms. The second is that internationally linked firms are more productive. This is like we find everywhere else. You know, make a Google out productivity of internationally linked firms. This is what happens everywhere. But what we find for Pakistan is suggestive evidence of a process of selection and learning for foreign-owned firms. So foreign investors select more productive firms, but also firms increase their productivity as they are foreign acquired. And then a process only of learning, or mainly of learning for exporters. The third finding is that tariffs do hurt firms' productivity. The main channel there is the intermediate input channel. Again, this is aligned with evidence for other countries. And the fourth finding is that services FDI upstream boost productivity of firms downstream, aligned with a story of vertical spillovers in which you have a supplier-client relationship that is productivity enhancing. So FDI upstream also facilitates investment in intangibles. So these are the main four results on which we're going to focus the presentation. So what is the evidence out there and how the paper fits into that literature? So basically there are two branches of literature looking at this. In general, there is sort of a separation, papers separate. On one hand, the analysis of trade policy distortions on productivity downstream, so intermediate input tariffs and their effects on productivity downstream. The channels there are that there is more import competition when input tariffs fall in the input markets, and that benefits downstream firms. There is also learning through technology that is embedded in these inputs, and that then leads to increases in productivity. Basically, technological choices are unlocked for firms, so firms can produce in a more productive way. So this has been reported, probably the seminal paper is Amity and Konings 2007 that reports for Indonesia an active channel linking import tariff reductions on inputs and productivity downstream. Later, Topalov and Khandelwal show something similar for India. Probably our paper links the most with that of Topalov and Khandelwal. For Indonesia, sorry, for China, U 2015 tells a relatively similar story. There is also a branch of literature looking at how FDI in upstream services sectors increase productivity downstream. And again, this is related with more FDI upstream, implying more availability of better services or more varied services inputs that lead to learning through embedded technological context, content, and innovation effects. And here there is evidence for India, Arnold and others, for Chile, Fernandez and Paunol, for Indonesia, Dugan and I, and Beverelli and others more recently do a cross-country study revealing similar FDI spillovers from services into downstream firms. Now, if one focuses on the evidence for Pakistan, the evidence is a little bit more limited, in part because firm-level data has been scarce. So probably among the most important papers that we've reviewed is a paper by Wado and others that does a survey on textile exporters and links innovation patterns with labor productivity. There is a paper by Assam and others on relying on a management practices survey, linking management practices with productivity. In that case, it's not labor productivity, it's total factor productivity. And then if one moves from that, there is work by Chowdhury and Hasib that focuses on the census of manufacturing of industry and on enterprise service, so again, cross-sections, and then enterprise service from the World Bank used by Kinda 2012 to look at multinationals and performance, again, with enterprise service of the World Bank. More recently, there is a paper by Siddiqui from PI that looks at TFP growth in Pakistan from a long-term perspective, but focuses at the macro level, not at the firm level. So basically, our paper comes to fill a gap there, looking at a panel of firms for a period 2012-2017 and linking this story of trade and productivity. So in terms of the data, as I mentioned before, we use data on publicly listed firms from the financial statements analysis of companies. These are firms in the non-financial sector that are listed in the Pakistan Stock Exchange, right? So these firms, this subset of firms, are large, and they account for a relatively large portion of Pakistan's GDP. So 13% of Pakistan's GDP is accounted for these firms, and they're, as I mentioned, they're large. They employ on average 380 employees. So there are a particular set of firms, and results should be evaluated from that lens, taking into account that we're talking about large firms here. We match this data with data from Bureau van Dijk to get information on foreign ownership, that is, on the presence of foreign investors in the board of these firms. So let me get into some of the preliminary results and sort of descriptive statistics, perhaps. So what we do is we estimate total factor productivity, the revenue measure, so TFPR, using Ackerberg and others, 2015, the ACF, We also use an alternative measure that is based on a solar residual that we use for robustness, but we're going to focus on the presentation of the results that emerge from estimating TFPR using ACF. So probably the first finding that I mentioned before, you can see it in this table. Productivity growth has been slow, and you see that in the first column when you see overall TFP growth averaging for all of the period 2.5% per year. Now, if you decompose, you can decompose the GDP growth in two parts. You can decompose it into how much it is due to firms on average becoming more productive, the within firm component, given their market shares. And then the other component being, given the productivity on average, how much productivity grows because resources flow from less productive into more productive firms. And so what you see here is that actually all of the productivity growth observed in aggregate is driven by the second part, that is between firm productivity growth. Not firms growing in productivity, but more productive firms absorbing more resources and becoming larger. So market share, so these more productive firms growing. So that is consistent with a creative destruction type of process, as was first mentioned by Schumpeter many years ago. But it's important notice is the fact that since 2015, productivity on average, so the within firm component, productivity, average productivity of firms has actually been stagnant or falling rather than increasing. So any change in aggregate productivity driven just from reallocation of resources. Now, we then look at what happens with these internationally linked firms. Do they perform better? And if they perform better, can we learn a little bit on why that is? So we first focus on foreign-owned firms, and we find when we compare averages of productivity of foreign-owned firms and non-foreign-owned firms, so domestic firms, we see that foreign-owned firms are more productive. The gap is between those firms that are domestic over all of the period and foreign over all of the period. The gap is about 66% difference. So a productivity premium about 66%. Now, what we do is we differentiate these averages in productivity in three groups. Group one is domestic over the entire period. Group two is that they're going to be acquired by a foreign investor in the next year. And group three is that they have been always foreign. They have always had foreign investors in the board. So what you see there is, and if you focus on the averages that are in the bottom row, what you see there is that the productivity premium of these foreign firms is driven both, and again, this is suggestive evidence, right? But it's driven both by foreign investors cherry picking more productive firms. And you can see that because the productivity of firms that are going to be acquired next year by foreign investors is larger, is 39% greater than the productivity of domestic firms. So foreign investors cherry pick more productive firms. But also, when you compare always foreign owned, when those that are going to be acquired, there is also a premium of 26%. So that's the gap between column 3 and 2. So basically, yes, there is selection, but on top of selection, there is something that makes the firms that have systematically been foreign owned even better performing than those that are going to be acquired. So a productivity premium of foreign enterprises driven both by some a selection mechanism, a cherry picking of most productive firms by investors from abroad, and then also foreign firms performing better over time. We do the same for exporters. So we look at those firms that never export, those firms that are going to export in the following period, and those firms that exported over the entire period. Those are the first three columns of that table. And what we see here is sort of a different story. What you see here is little evidence of selection. So there is a little bit of a difference between the productivity of firms on average that never exported with those that are going to export next year. But that difference is not statistically significant. It's a 2% difference that is imprecisely estimated. But there is a productivity difference between those that are going to export and those that systematically export. And that productivity difference is about 22% and is substantial. So this is suggestive evidence that there is some evidence of learning by exporting. So it's not selection in that export productivity premium, is more of a learning by exporting that again is suggestive, but it could be aligned with recent findings of Atkin, for example, for the case of Egypt using experimental methods. Now, let's go to the core of the paper, that is estimating the effects of policy changes and outcome changes in terms of integration on productivity of firms. So what we want to do is we want to estimate the effect of upstream tariffs and upstream FDI. And to do that, the first equation basically regresses TFPR for a firm I within a sector S in period T on the upstream tariff, so the tariffs faced for inputs of firms in that sector in the previous period, the tariff in the same sector, and a set of firm and sector level controls plus a vector of year effects V and a vector of firm effects U. And then we have an augmented specification. This is the second equation, in which on top of the upstream tariff and the output, the tariff in the same sector, what we add is FDI upstream in manufacturing, FDI upstream in services, and a vector of controls that include FDI in the same sector and other firm characteristics. The way we measure upstream tariffs is basically as an upstream FDI is basically as a weighted average, in which what we do is we weight the tariffs using input shares from the 2007 input-output table that GTAP constructs for Pakistan, and we do the same for FDI. So the shares, the input shares, are constant over the whole period. So any variation that we see in that measure of upstream tariffs or FDI upstream is variation that comes from that measure of integration. Right? So basically, the identifying assumption here is that firms in sectors that use more intensively a particular input will benefit more from changes in tariffs on that input, right? So we use lagged explanatory variables to reduce the scope for endogeneity. Now, it is also possible that sectors that have lower productivity will lobby for higher tariff protection, right? So if that's the case, then that's a pickle, as the British say, right? Because then the relation becomes endogenous. So what we do is we follow Topalov and Candelwall 2011 approach, and what we do is basically we test whether there is evidence of that by regressing or correlating sectoral TFP in T-1 with tariffs in T to see if there is any association between lag productivity and tariffs. And so what we do, what we find, and you can see this in the top table does that for tariffs, the bottom table does that for FDI. So what we do is we find evidence that that is the case actually for the entire period. And so what we try to do is we try to see, does this happen systematically, or is this something that is happening in a particular period? So we isolate that spike in tariffs that happens through as a consequence of the twin crisis in 2013 from the rest of the period in which the tariff changes are to some extent driven by the IMF EFF program that could be considered to some extent exogenously determined. And what we see is that actually, yes, the evidence that we see in that relationship between lag TFP at the sector level and tariffs is driven. So it's basically concentrated in the period 2013-2014. If one focuses instead of 2014-2017, that relationship vanishes, and we see no evidence of that reverse story. A similar pattern is found for FDI, so in the bottom table, but only for FDI in manufacturing, upstream, not for FDI in service. So in light of this, what we do is we say, okay, let's split so let's look at the sub-period 2014-2017, for which we have a little bit more confidence that we are looking so that this tariff variation and FDI variation is truly exogenous to productivity. And that combined with the fact that we are lagging the explanatory variance. So let's go to the results. And let me go to the results. And so this is the baseline specification that the results from estimating the first equation that I showed you earlier. And what we see here is you are going to see 4 columns. So the first 3 columns look at the whole period without firm fixed effects, with firm fixed effects, and with firm fixed effects and sector year trends. And then the last column shows the period in which we have more confidence on the exogeneity of the tariff variation that we are using. So what you see is that there is a negative effect of input tariffs on productivity downstream, and the effect persists even when we look at that restricted data set. So the restricted time frame, rather. To give you a sense of magnitude of these effects, so basically what these results imply is that a 1 standard deviation change in tariffs upstream leads to a change in productivity of 1.3% downstream. So 1 standard deviation change in tariffs in our sample is basically a change of 1/5 of a percentage point. To give you, to put this in perspective, the recent budget that was just approved, the Finance Act, brought in a tariff rationalization that reduced tariffs on average by 0.4 percentage points. So that would be 2 standard deviations. So we would expect, if we believe these results, that productivity will increase, downstream productivity of firms will increase 2.6% because of these reductions in tariffs of 0.4 of a percentage point. The next results we present are for FDI. So when we focus on FDI upstream, services and manufacturing, what is it that we find? So basically what we find is evidence of spillovers, vertical, but from services into downstream firms. So not from manufacturing, but from service. We find no evidence of coefficients are imprecisely estimated. Interestingly, when we add this FDI in upstream services sectors, what happens is that the coefficient in upstream tariffs falls a little bit, but remains significant. Just again, to give you a sense of economic significance of these results, a 10% increase in FDI inflows leads to a 1% increase in productivity. If we take the coefficient from the last column 4, there for the reduced time frame in which we have confidence in the exogeneity of the controls. Now, what we do next is we try to understand a little bit better what the underlying mechanisms or the characteristics of these results are. And so we're going to look at 3 things. We first look at what is it that tariffs actually do with the imports of intermediates. The second thing is we want to understand a little bit better whether that effect that we identify on input tariffs on productivity is really input tariffs or is something else. And then third, the last one is we're going to look a little bit under the magnifying glass. What is it that is happening with that effect of upstream services FDI on downstream productivity? So let's start with tariffs and imports of intermediates. So what we do here is we examine how responsive imports of intermediate inputs are to changes in input tariffs along the intensive and extensive margins. So here what we do is we use data from UN countries. So this is trade data. So we are regressing imports of intermediate inputs on lagged tariffs, right? So this is at 6 digits of the harmonized system. And the top table shows what happens with the intensive margin. The bottom table shows what happens with the extensive margin. So what we see is that imports of intermediates are reactive in values. So the values increase after tariffs fall, which is what we would predict because tariffs add to the price of these important intermediates. And then we also see that the number of product varieties, when we look at the extensive margin, also increases when these tariffs fall. So basically, what we are seeing here is that firms had access, as tariffs fell, firms had access not only to increased values of imports of intermediates, but also to increase varieties that could have relaxed their productivity constraints and thereby contributing to their productivity upgrade. Now, the second thing we do is as I mentioned before, is we want to rule out that other reforms that may have been concurrent with reductions in tariffs or tariff rationalization may be driving this result. So what we want to do is we want to eliminate confounding factors. And to do that, we rely on the fact that it's not all firms that get this tariff, so that benefit from these tariff reductions de jure, right? So de jure, exporters are entitled to obtain duty refunds. And so if that's the case, in principle, they shouldn't benefit from tariff changes or be hurt because they don't pay them in the first place. But we also take advantage of the fact that we know that the process of claiming refunds is complex and there is a fixed cost associated with claiming the refunds, as I mentioned before. And therefore, we would expect smaller exporters to struggle with these refunds and therefore to benefit from just an across-the-board reduction in tariffs for intermediate inputs. So what we do is first, we split the sample in non-exporters and exporters. And when we split the sample in non-exporters and exporters, what we find is that that effect of upstream tariffs on productivity downstream actually is driven by non-exporters. So exporters do not benefit from changes in tariffs, do not benefit or are not hurt. So if tariffs fall, they don't benefit. If tariffs increase, they are not hurt. So this is basically consistent with a story in which exporters do get tariff refunds, and therefore they don't benefit from overall change, from across the board changes in tariffs. But the second thing that we do is we say, okay, let's focus on exporters, and this is what the right-hand side of the table shows. And let's split the exporters into domestic and foreign and into small and large. And then what you see there is this story of probably, this is suggestive again, but probably this story that the fixed cost of claiming incentives, so that there is a fixed cost, right? So the average cost decreases in firm size. So for small exporters, so those at the bottom of the distribution, basically upstream tariff reductions helps their productivity. For large exporters, it doesn't. And so to be sure, because we are looking at publicly listed firms, so someone would say, well, but even the small firms in your sample are still large firms. So what we do is we look at, okay, what is the average size of these small exporters that we have in our sample, and how does it compare to the classification of firms across the country? So look at the CMI mileposts for firm size, or the SMEDA milepost for firm size, or the SVP milepost for firm size. And so what we see is that our small firms, so small firms in our sample, are comparable to a medium firm in the average, in the average across the economy. So these firms are not small by the general in the general universe of firms in Pakistan, but they are more like medium-sized firms in that general public. So these medium-sized firms, still being medium-sized in the general universe, they seem to gain from across the board tariff reduction. So this seems to be a story that is consistent with the fact that we are identifying actually the effect of input or upstream tariffs on productivity downstream. And the last thing that we do is we look at, under the magnifying glass, so to speak, this FDI in services story and the link to productivity. And so here what we do is we do two things. First is we look at the characteristics of those who gain from FDI, and in particular we look at something that the literature does, that is saying, to gain from spillovers from upstream FDI, do you need to be a top performer, or do you need to be far away from the frontier, right? So probably you need some degree of absorptive capabilities, but if you're already in the frontier, there's not much space for learning. If you're further away from the frontier, there's more space for learning. So what we find here is that when we split the sample in non-frontier firms and frontier firms, so those closer to the productivity, to the top end of the productivity distribution and those further away, we see that those that gain from FDI upstream in services are those that are non-frontier. Those that gain more from it are those that are non-frontier. And then when we see what perhaps is the underlying mechanism, what we look at is whether FDI in services upstream is associated with a better performance in terms of innovation or investments in intangible assets. And so what we see here is that FDI in services upstream is associated systematically with increased investments in intangible assets, which may be behind the finding of linking FDI upstream and productivity downstream, because it facilitates investment in intangible assets that lead to increases in productivity. So with this, I will stop. So in conclusion, 4 main points. Productivity in Pakistan, according to our results, stagnant, aggregate gains being driven by more productive firms gaining market shares rather than firms becoming more productive on average. Internationally linked firms perform better than domestic-owned firms or than domestic-oriented firms. For exporters, it was learning. For foreign-owned, it was a combination of selection and learning. Third, that integration in global marketplace of upstream sectors, both for goods and services, has led to increase in productivity downstream, mainly for non-exporters or smaller exporters that do not have access to refund schemes, and that upstream FDI services increases productivity downstream, mainly or probably through an effect on making more feasible these investments in intangible assets that end up increasing productivity. So I'll stop here, and it'll be great to listen to some questions and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varela. That was a very interesting talk. So Fayaz Hussain asked that what has been the role of energy crisis and bad law and order situation on total factor productivity? Any thoughts on that issue?
Okay, so I think I'm going to take the questions as, but Gonzalo, please feel free to step in if you want to add. So I think this is a very interesting question, and the short answer is that we haven't considered this in this current version, but I think it is quite relevant, and we're going to be looking into this in particular, I think, because the variation that we exploit is at the sector level, and so one might be concerned that some sector might be more or less exposed to the energy crisis, and so I think we will have to look into this. So thank you for raising this point.
So if I may add one thing here. So
sure.
Just from an analytical point of view, the law and order, so both the energy crisis and the law and order, as Stefania mentioned, are crucial elements, right? That affect uncertainty and affect, when in one case, directly costs and technological choices, that is energy, the law and order affect the uncertainty. Both, so the energy, so Stefania covered it. The law and order is a macro level variable. So from an analytical point of view, we have year effects that are capturing that effect of law and order changes. Over.
Then we have another question that asks that are productivity differences between small exporters and small non-exporters and large exporters and non-exporters. So do you in your study find any productivity differences between small exporters versus non-exporters as well as large exporters versus non-exporters?
Okay, so yes, again, this is, I don't have an answer here because we didn't look at this specifically as we focused on exporters, because our aim was to pick up this effect of exemptions, but I think we could definitely learn. I think we did initially conduct a set of heterogeneous effects analysis, and I cannot recall, but I think again, thank you for pointing this out. I think we will also look at this as we definitely learn from exploring heterogeneous effect across firms.
Thank you, Dr. Stefania. Then there's another question by Muhammad Ijaz, and he's asking how much of the productivity gains by foreign firms can be attributed to dominant currency pricing. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so what I would say is that as it stands, our analysis of foreign ownership, I think, is only suggestive, and I think it's a lot of research that can be done on these issues, and we haven't gone that far, unfortunately. So I'm sorry that I'm actually taking these more as comments for in my to-do list, and so thank you very much. And and again, I don't have a direct answer unless Gonzalo knows from his other.
I'm trying to, so perhaps we can get a clarification from Mohammed Ejaz, because the dominant currency paradigm, I mean, I believe he means which was presented in the American Economic Review paper of 2020. Gita Gopinath was the lead author there, I think. Basically talks about the way contracts, so export contracts are denominated in dominant currencies, right? So I'm struggling a little bit to see the link here, but perhaps if we can have even an offline clarification of the question, because I really like the topic, but I'm not seeing, so I'm quite into this dominant currency paradigm. And I have another paper looking at that, but I'm not following exactly how would it link to this story. So perhaps if offline we can continue the conversation, we could.
Then we have a few hand raises, so I'll request Dr. Muazzam to please ask your question now.
Thank you, Dr. Hamna. Thank you, Stefania and Gonzalo. I thought you have some very interesting results. If I may, in 30 seconds, I think the most important result you have is that your output tariffs are moot, in the sense that they're not always consistently positive or negative, whereas your input tariffs are consistently negative, and I think that's a very important result. If I may just put in my 50 cents worth, which is, I have Shamaila Chaudhry and myself have been playing with, this is not our area, but we've been playing much more on the macro side. And we do find two sets of results, one of which is consistent with yours, which is, yes, productivity, and however you measure it, aggregate productivity and TFP and different versions of it have been stagnant or falling. But what we find is that what exports have been based upon is unit labor costs. So we have a formula of ULCs, which is equal to the wage divided by productivity multiplied by the exchange rate. So basically what industrialists in Pakistan have been doing is, if their numerator, if their denominator is productivity is not doing very well, then, and they can't lower the nominal wage, then they use the exchange rate. And they have consistently used the exchange rate to lower unit labor costs. But leaving you with that thought. Thank you. Enjoyed your paper.
So thank you very much for these comments. And so yes, indeed. We also discuss the fact that indeed we do not find an effect of output tariffs, while our effect of input tariffs is strong and negative throughout several specifications. So indeed, a reduction in input tariffs really seems to be working through the channel of intermediate inputs rather than a competitive effect in the own sector. So interesting also your comment about TFP. So I will definitely look again into your work and see whether we can also make some links to our study there, further links. Thank you.
Then we have another question by Muhammad Khan. So I will just unmute him, and Muhammad Khan, if you can please go ahead and ask your question. Muhammad Khan, are you there? Okay, so there's another question by Dr. Muhammad Nadeem Hanif. During your presentation, he had also requested for you to please go to slide 12. I think he wanted to have a look at that again. And then also he's asking if these results can be generalized to all sectors, especially sectors like food or textile. Has there been any kind of sectoral analysis that's been done as part of this study?
So so our data cover, if I recall correctly, 11 sectors. So it can be generalized across these sectors definitely, and they are manufacturing sectors mostly. And they are, yes. So when we our analysis on tariffs is on the manufacturing sectors only, yes. And what we do in the paper is that we look a little bit at variations within sectors. We look at dispersions in productivity, and we do observe that there are the variations in TFP even within sectors and across sectors. And we also observe that some sectors experienced, obviously, as we saw in one of the graphs, some experienced increases in tariffs, while other, on average, experienced a decrease in tariffs. And so what we've been doing so far is to try to understand what are the sectors that have been mostly impacted in terms of TFP. We haven't done any analysis purely at the sector level to observe whether the response to changes in tariffs is different across sectors. So we haven't done that. And again, this is a very helpful comment. And again, I'm going to add it to our to-do list as, you know, and to see whether we, but again, what I think something else I want to say is that indeed the textile sector is the predominant sector in our analysis, but we also represent the other sectors again. So is this the slide that was back? Okay, so it's back there. Okay. So if there are any question about this, no, it was this slide about TFP decomposition, I think, in case there are questions about this later.
Thank you, Dr. Stefania. Then there's some queries about the data set that you guys are using. So Dr. Teresa Chaudhary asks if you could tell us a bit more about the data that you're using. And then relatedly, Asjad Naqvi is asking why use GTAP 7 as opposed to GTAP 10 or EOR 826, which gives more recent information on Pakistan.
Okay, so I take both. So, and then I think Gonzalo might add a little bit on the type of input-output table. So in terms of the data, so our data set covers the universe of listed firms. So they are about less than 400 firms. What we have access to is financial statements. So this is a usual data set where we know sales, wages, investment. Unfortunately, we do not have data on employees. So we try to impute information on employees as we could perfectly match this data set with Bureau van Dijk data set. But unfortunately, the data on employees is not good. There's a lot of missing information. So ultimately, we couldn't use that. But we were able to recover information on foreign ownership from this additional data set. If there are any other specific question on the specific variable, I'm also happy to elaborate further. In terms of input-output table, so the key thing is that we want to have an input-output table that is determined, so that refers to the structural features of the economy before any changes in tariffs, as we do not want these to actually affect input shares. We want them to be fixed so that the only variation that we are capturing is that induced by tariff changes. So that is the reason why we use the predetermined input-output table. Now, I think another table might have been available, which I think we also tried and got similar results. I think the aggregation presented in this table was much more favorable in terms of matching with our data. I think this is, and we do not expect, I mean, what is important is that the structural features of the economy hasn't changed significantly over this period. And so, you know, we reasonably think that this didn't happen over this 5 years period. Yes, no, yes, is it longer? I think it's a bit longer. What do we have? 2007, yes. So from 2007 to 2012, this is the year where our analysis starts. So I don't know, Gonzalo, if you want to add anything on.
So two things. The first one is, so EORA, so we would advise against EORA for this type of analysis, given the quality of the data in EORA. So EORA is a great undertaking in many respects, but because of the country coverage is so large, they are very heroic assumptions that are made in compiling those global input-output tables. So I would prefer not using EORA. The rest, I think Stefania has explained. If the person asking the question had access to GDAP10, we would be very interested in having that input-output table. And then also, as Stefania mentioned, we used the IFPRI one, but the sectoral aggregations were not as favorable.
We have a few more questions. So John Morrow is asking, do you have any sense about the role of China-Pakistan trade agreement on productivity or foreign ownership?
If I may take this one, Stefania.
Yes, definitely, yes.
So we don't look in this paper, we don't look at that. So we don't look at the China-Pakistan trade agreement on productivity. We don't. So that's the short answer. The reason I wanted to take this question is because actually we have a note that I recently released that you can find online, that is import duties and economic performance, some stylized facts for Pakistan, that looks at the link between the China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement and export performance. So it doesn't look at the link with productivity, but looks at the link with export performance. And the interesting thing that we see there is that even if the dependent variable there is export performance rather than productivity, the channels through which things happen are very similar to what we find in this paper. So the China-Pakistan Free Trade Agreement brought about more imports from China, right? So sectors that competed with those imports struggled. and they lost competitiveness. But sectors that actually used those inputs, so those imports as inputs into whatever they produced, they actually became more competitive in third markets. So the intermediate input channel is also present there in the data when one looks at the China-Pakistan trade agreement and its impact on export performance, non-productivity. Happy to share the note with the person who asked the question.
Thank you for that answer. And Dr. Azam Chaudhry has a question. So,
Hi, Gonzalo. Hi, Stefania. I at 3:15. I'm sorry, at 3:59, I was going to greet you, and then I was actually on the phone, so I apologize. I wanted to say we're really excited to have you. We're doing a lot of interesting firm-level work here at the Lahore School and in Pakistan generally. One of the questions I had was what John had said, and then Teresa asked about the data. And then I was wondering about issues of which are now becoming very popular about quality of output and then variety. And I know when you described when I was thinking of the question, I was thinking you might have had access to the CMI data or be able to figure out quality, because actually it's sort of building on what Gonzalo said, which is we had done a little bit of research looking at using CMI before and after the Pak-China, the FTA, and we found that, that there were a huge increase in exports to China, but there was a decrease in the productivity of the firms that were actually exporting to China because they were producing lower quality goods and less variety. So I don't know, this is, beyond the scope of your data set, but there is also the CMI 2017-18, which is floating around somewhere in the government, and we haven't had access to it, but if you can get access to it, I know the State Bank does and other people do, but that would really be interesting because I know quality and variety is a big issues which are popping up. But again, I wanted to thank you guys for coming. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you. That's a great suggestion, if I may say. It's a great suggestion. We don't have access to the data, unfortunately. We've been trying to get access to the data, but we don't have that, the new census. It would be great when we have it, to have these two cross sections spaced out in time and answer this type of questions. That's a great suggestion, Sam. Thank you.
So there are two more questions, one by Nadia Set, and she's asking, on the basis of your work in the context of Pakistan, what are your thoughts about the main factor being as the key driver of productivity?
So I may jump in here, Stefania. So Nadia, great to see that you're connected. This is a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think we can answer it with our paper. But so there are many drivers of productivity, and ideally one would want to have a paper in which you could have, for example, that work that Assam did on managerial practices and the link with productivity, the work that Wado has done on innovation and productivity, and then restrictions that are outside the scope of firms' actions, like, for example, tariffs or FDI in upstream sectors, and put all of this together and then do a sort of a horse race of which of the channels actually accounts for more of the changes. So this is not what we do in this paper. So in this paper, we just looked at particularly at two things, that is FDI and tariffs upstream, right? So when you look at these two things, what you see is perhaps tariffs play a more tariffs in upstream sectors, right? So input tariffs play a more important role, but also that is related to the fact that there has been very little FDI. So perhaps with more FDI or more widespread links between multinationals and domestic companies, that would be slightly different. So it's a great question. It's a very important question. It's difficult to answer. I would say, based on the evidence that is out there, we would say a little bit of that is managerial practices, and this is why all these programs of upgrading capabilities are so important for boosting productivity. A little bit of it is innovation, a little bit of it is trade policy and investment policy, etc. So, over.
And then I think we've asked something similar before, but there's another question by Zara in which she's asking that have you seen any significant differences in results across manufacturing sectors? In particular, have you observed any different results for large sectors such as textiles and clothing for Pakistan?
Yeah, so as actually we could actually do this in particular. We could focus on the textile sector only and see whether it might be different from the rest, because this is where most of our firms are. So this is something we can do. We haven't done it yet, and so we are planning to explore sectoral differences as we can, because we cover 11 sectors.
That's great. I think one last question. So Muhammad Khan is asking that what do you suggest might be the best ways of boosting productivity? I think you've spoken about that just a few minutes ago, but anything else if you would like to add in response to his specific question? Otherwise, I guess that should be the end of our very interesting and very engaging question and answer session.
Yeah, you mute. I think Gonzalo, you want
yes.
to, yeah.
Let me say just one thing on this. So I think this paper, if one focuses on this paper in particular, the policy implication is quite straightforward, right? So what we are unveiling is tariffs actually hurt the productivity of firms that use those inputs that have tariffs imposed on them, right? So get rid of tariffs. More structurally move away from a system that collects revenues from tariffs to a system that collects other types of revenues, but that's out of the scope of the paper. But what the paper clearly shows is productivity is affected negatively by tariffs on intermediate inputs. And it also shows that productivity is affected negatively by lack of FDI in upstream sectors. So policies that boost FDI, basically elimination of restrictions to investment and to foreign investment, and active policies of promotion of FDI would be a policy implication. And in the area of tariff policy, reductions of tariffs is another policy implication.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Gonzalo and Dr. Stefania. It was lovely to have you guys present on a topic that's extremely important for our economy, especially at this point in time. And thank you to the audience for sending in lots of questions and making this discussion very interesting and engaging. Please don't forget to tune in again next week for Dr. Mehreen Mahmood's talk. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Amna.